Balkan countries are standing currently in terms of EU integration process, especially now when Albania and Montenegro are progressing and basically taking the role of front runners in the process. So another question is, whether the European perspective can continue to serve as a shared vision for the region, and in general, is it real? Is like European perspective still something real and tangible?
And moderating this session is Marko Pelec, consulting senior analyst on the Balkans at the International Crisis Group. And the panelists, speakers are Mr. Arjan Durmice, Albanian name, don't know why I misspelled it, Executive Director and founder of the Center for Study of Democracy and Governance, Valeska Esh, non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Europe Center, Anna Maria Velinovska, researcher at the Institute for Democracy Societas Civilis, and Nevenka Voksanovic, who's the director of the Center for Democracy and Human Rights. We want to do justice to this last but not less important panel, so we appreciate everyone's patience in listening to them as carefully as we did in the previous ones. So.
Yes, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I think we can all agree that it's not the least important, since, as our hosts have pointed out, we have talked about little else other than enlargement for much of today. So clearly it's a topic on people's minds. I know it's the end of the day, everyone's tired, everyone's a bit distracted, hopefully we've all had our coffee. We are compressed down to just under an hour, so we will try to compensate with a bit more energy and pep for the late hour. I want to begin the panel by doing a mental exercise, or inviting you to do a mental exercise, our panelists. Also, imagine that it is 2030 and we're all back here for the Kosovo Peace and Democracy Summit in Pristina. What will we be talking about? Okay, will there still be an EU of 27, or if not, will it be 28, 29? What will the other countries be doing at that time, 5 years in the future? Push it maybe a little bit further back, 10 years in the future. What will we be talking about then? What will the EU be like then? What will the enlargement debate be like in 10 years' time, or in 20 years' time, in 2045? What will we be going through, and what will be happening in the countries that haven't yet joined the EU? I'm thinking about that because, as it happens, the title of this year's seminar, New World Disorder, happens to be taken from a book that came out when I was just starting out in graduate school in 1992. So 33 years ago was when people began talking about these sorts of issues. And in fact, already at that time, in a kind of embryonic way, the idea of enlarging the European Union, it wasn't even called the European Union then, enlarging Europe as a potentially very useful policy lever to deal with problems right here on the territory of what was then Yugoslavia was already in the air. So these ideas have a history, and these processes can take a long time. Now, since that time, of course, 4 countries in the neighborhood have joined the EU: Slovenia in 2004, Bulgaria and Romania in 2007, and Croatia in 2013. A period of just under 10 years out of this 33-year period. And since then, nothing. So that's a bit of a conundrum. That is, of course, a description of one European Union enlargement process, the formal one that ends when a country joins and becomes a member state. But there are a couple of other senses in which we can talk about enlargement and think about enlargement. There's the enlargement narrative or discourse, which is kind of like the soundtrack to everything that goes on in the region. It's always seen in the context of what does it mean for this country's European future. I don't need to tell you about this, you've heard a lot about it. And there is also the maybe more subtle process of countries which may not even believe that they ever will join the European Union, at least not anytime particularly soon, nonetheless going through and enacting reforms which have an effect, reforms that are asked of them by Brussels. So we've got a lot to talk about. The way we're going to do this is each of our wonderful panelists, and we have a very diverse and experienced panel for you this afternoon, people who have been in government and also on the outside. They're each going to give about a roughly 5-minute statement, and then we're going to have some discussion between ourselves, and then we will open it out to you, and then we will all go and have some drinks. So I think we have discussed. Ariane, I will ask you to go first.
Thank you, Marco, for the introduction. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and good afternoon to everyone. I'd like to offer my reflections about the perspective of the Western Balkans, whether they are on track for the 2030 deadline, particularly for Albania and Montenegro, which are tipped to be there. And I just will provide 5 reflections, I think. It's about the horizons. In itself, 2030 is ambitious and necessary, but it's not self-executing. We have to bear in mind that the renewed enlargement has been resulting from geopolitical factors, so it's become a geopolitical priority again due to the war in Ukraine. So there is a demand by the EU for the countries to prepare for accession, but in the case of Albania and Montenegro, it is not a deadline 2030, rather it is a political signal. So for this political signal to materialize, it requires both the accession countries to get their preparation completed, but on the other hand, for the European Union also, it has to conduct its own decision-making reforms, because particularly the unanimity decision-making on foreign affairs and on budgetary issues is an impediment in itself for the EU to accept new members without having this reform. So there is a risk that if this does not happen, this preparedness between both sides, then it will lead to a further disappointment. So asking to your question, maybe in 2030, perhaps we can, we are not sure that we can talk on optimistic notes. My second point is about Albania and Montenegro. They are on track, but when it comes to their preparedness, it's not guaranteed. Depoliticization of institutions, rule of law enforcement, public administration reform and professionalism, civic space protection. These are areas which the countries can backslide very easily. And because cluster 1, under which these areas are falling, is the cluster which will be closed last. So there is still the risk that the countries may miss their preparedness. On the other hand, what will result as a result, we will see as a result of this process, even if it goes well, we are seeing a multi-speed Balkans. So there is a change in from a previous assumption, which all the countries, they were based, the progress accession was based on merit, but there was a package approach, based on which regional cooperation was also a strong element of it. But now we see that North Macedonia is suffering because of constitutional blockages. Serbia has stalled because of its own problems. Bosnia and Herzegovina has their plans, but they are blocked, and also Kosovo. So we are seeing a certain reality which is changing even within the region, and this fragmentation is not good. Another point, reflection that I would make is about reaching the out of the European Union member state public. It has been mentioned during the day, the findings from the EU barometer about the position of the countries of the EU member, the publics of the EU countries that are kind of fluctuating. So there are good news and bad news in this respect. The problem will be that the countries will have to reach out the national audiences of the member states, because even if by 2027, 2028, there will be a preparedness by the countries, there will have to be a process of going through the national parliaments, and in this respect, the countries are not ready and they have not made their points in this respect. And the last point is the enlargement light that is considered like having the partial accession or allowing countries to have access to certain aspects like the single market or partial participation. This is good in the sense that it will be a bridge, but it will not be a waiting room again for some other period to come. So these are some of the points that I wanted to make that can also help for continuing our discussion in the panel.
Thank you. I'll now turn to Anna Maria Velinovska.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this panel discussion. At times we think that everything about enlargement and the EU accession has been said, but I see today that the topic of enlargement has been brought up multiple times throughout the panel discussions. I will try to bring up the perspective from North Macedonia and how it relates in the general regional context. North Macedonia, the country where I come from, is a very interesting and paradoxical example of EU accession process. Today, it is the most aligned and predictable partner the EU has in the Western Balkans. North Macedonia has been fully aligned with the common security and foreign and security policy of the European Union and has been a reliable NATO partner for several years now. However, the process has been politically stuck for 3 years now, mostly because of political issues and not technical issues. As it is probably known, we have to do constitutional amendments in order to move forward with the EU accession process. Although the country has received probably the most amount of positive recommendations from the Commission for starting negotiations since 2009. So, for illustration, we've been in the process for about 2 decades now. So when we talk about the EU accession and we say that lately, since the war on European soil, it has the geopolitical pressure to enlarge. It feels like the geopolitical pressure does not apply to all Western Balkan countries, because one would think that when there is a geopolitical pressure that political issues would be probably resolved faster, but in the case of North Macedonia that hasn't happened, and a resolution for a bilateral dispute has not been found. So that left the country in terms, the latest progress report has shown that there is a limited progress in the fundamentals. And we see that there is not a lot of reforms done, although we also have the growth plan. So the constant blocking of the process is now risking the country to probably limit its progress on the democratic level and in terms of implementing reforms. The tone that's been set in the country regarding the EU from the government, but also from the people, has been very cynical. So because of the duration of the process, now everyone talks about the process, a lot coming from the government in place from 2024, so from last year, but also from the people working in this field for many, many years, is a cynical tone that whatever we are going to do, there will not be any progress. So to go back, whether we are going to be on track or left behind, during today's lunch discussion, I discussed with one of the participants and he said to me, well, you need to run if you want to get on the 2030 track, which I think is pretty much the exact description of what we're going to have to do if we want to get the 2030 track. Unfortunately, in my opinion, I don't think that after Albania and Montenegro, that there will be enlargement very soon afterwards. So I think that it will be benefit for the country and probably for the EU to show a success in a country that has lost the path for so many times now. Although I must say that it feels like that, but the citizens are mainly pro-European. So for a country that has been 20 years in the process, 70% of the citizens still support EU membership, which is very high percentage if you ask me. So one thing is that, and that puts North Macedonia as a very unfortunate example of how the EU accession process can turn out. And in order to catch the 2030 train or track, I would follow up on the side that the EU must do the reforms itself as well. And on that note, I think that the new budget will show us whether EU is serious about enlargement as well, because if there are no funds in there for cohesion, for transition, I think that the 2030 deadline is probably just a political incentive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Nevenka, would you follow up on that?
I made so many points, so please remind me of the time, because I do want to reflect on the things that were said before. Since this morning, Montenegro has been mentioned several times, and I would like to paint the picture how actually this fast-paced accession, the last phase of it, is going on for Montenegro, and how actually we made it happen. Not by our own achievements, but a pure political will coming from the EU representatives. So since this morning, Montenegro has been mentioned as a front runner a couple of times, and to end today's sessions for now in a more optimistic note, I would say that is correct, because of definitely compelling political narrative to the EU audience, either really EU audience or EU audience on domestic turf. And it is, plastically speaking, it is a very concrete, it's not a promise of 28 for Montenegro. We've been in discussion with members of the EU, of the EU Parliament, then with the delegation of the EU in Montenegro. And what we've received, and the same situation happened 2 months before we publicly received a positive EBAR, but we received now as an information that there is a contract already drafted for Montenegro for 28. So we have the slogan and everything, 28 by the 28. So it is something that is very much on the table for Montenegro, but that's because of two reasons. Of course, EU doesn't have an alternative in Montenegro, that is our goal, but also EU doesn't have an alternative in terms of new candidates. So Montenegro is like, and we've received those two comments. We're a small country, so economically speaking, we cannot destabilize or affect on the EU way too much. And politically speaking, we can also, we cannot make such a big of a chaos in the EU. So those two reasons are actually propelling us to be a front runner in this entire process. There are also two things that Montenegro needs to do, and we've heard that from the EU representatives. So first one is the technical part, and I can tell you immediately that you don't need to know how to do it. The EU will literally show it. They will literally draft everything to you. One constitutional court judge from Croatia on one training told us literally, just do what they tell you. Just copy paste everything, and then you will try to tailor it to the needs of your country. That's what we did. You should just do the same. And so technically speaking, what we've seen and what our institutions are trying to do is to close all the chapters until 2026. And technically speaking, it is possible, because not because we have the knowledge to do so, which is another advice for all the countries, just groom the knowledge, prepare the HR who will do everything that needs to be done in the last phase of accession, because trust me, you will need that kind of knowledge, but because the EU will show us how to do it in this phase. So the technical part is first, and the second part is political part. And that's where we struggle in Montenegro, but generally in Western Balkan region. But even that, so at least nominally, we have all the political parties who agree on the EU agenda. This morning, Ms. Slavišek mentioned functioning institutions. Is that what we need? We need functioning institutions in order to be a part of the EU. And I can add to that that German foreign minister also said no shortcuts for new countries. And in reality, we can see that that's not the case. So Montenegro received the best report, EU Commission report so far. But in fact, I can tell you that in practice, EU representatives often turn a blind eye to specific contradictions to the rule of law. We have a higher rating of political employment and nepotism. We have resurrection of nationalism and political agenda. We have a clear involvement of religion in state business. But when it comes to the assessment of the EU, they say, no. We literally, in closed discussions, we received that feedback. Yes, we know, but it's okay. You're moving forward. So that's what you need to do, just move forward. The clear example of that is that the EU wants us to have a full constitutional court. It is something that we are at the moment missing 2, but soon we will be missing 3 constitutional judges. And the fact is that political parties are literally fighting who is gonna appoint their political judge. It's also known a political court. So when it comes to the EU, they do not care about the internal fight between political parties, which is essentially a mirror of how our institutions are still captured. They only care that we appoint 3 judges. They do not care who it is. So in fact, is functioning institutions very much are not the priority for EU representatives. Even though we had a democratic change in 2020, I can tell you, and I will finish with that we essentially do not have a change in the model of ruling the state. So unfortunately, we will yet have to deal with the fact of becoming EU citizens, but also becoming everything else that these reforms should actually bring and reinstate in Montenegro.
Thank you. And last, Valeska.
Thank you very much. And actually, you kind of gave me the perfect starting point, because I would like to start with the point that I think that we have a bit of a gap between the EU's messaging on progress that we see in Albania and Montenegro and the actual assessment, and that includes the country report. If you look at the country report, for example, for Montenegro closely, even the Commission is very much warning that in order to fulfill its ambitious goal, Montenegro seriously needs to speed up. So even with the current pace of progress, and I'm not denying that there was some progress, 2028 is not achievable. And I think that is something that became very clear in the country report. And I see quite a few risks for that. Maybe to briefly comment also on potential deadlines, 2030 horizon, etc. I think we need to also be very careful because there isn't a single council document that has committed to any kind of date, and I think there is a good reason for that. This is not to say, though, that for as long as I have been engaged in issues of EU integration and the Balkans, I have never seen such a positive momentum for enlargement, to be honest, ever since Croatia joined. But I also think that we need to really be mindful. For example, you mentioned Foreign Minister Varda's statement that there are not going to be shortcuts, and then you were giving the examples, and I really think that this is exactly what I mean by the messaging that we see coming from the Commission, which is overly enthusiastic and positive. And on the one hand, I think it's a good thing because it kind of restores also a bit of a belief that it can actually happen. But I'm a bit worried, as someone who really wants to see the countries joining the European Union, that we're kind of over-promising at the moment because of what you were describing, a lack of independent institutions and slightly slower progress than we could actually believe. I want to briefly comment also on what was mentioned when it comes to EU decision-making and the internal reform. And a positive thing that I actually took from our foreign minister's visit to the region is that we have a sentence in the coalition agreement of the German government which basically says that internal EU reforms need to go hand in hand or need to happen at the latest by the next accession. I actually think that his messaging really tells us that even the German government would be ready to consider enlargement without an internal EU reform, because we cannot really rely that it's going to happen. And I believe really, I do really believe that we need to see this independent from one another. I think trying to not have an internal EU reform as a condition for enlargement is part of the reason why we have seen some debates. Politico was writing on it about post-accession criteria. I think Commissioner Kos called it probational membership or something. I think we need to be very careful also what that means for the region, and maybe we can discuss a bit about that later on. I think that you are very right when it comes to an internal debate in member states of the European Union. I can only speak for Germany, but in Germany, in the public debate, enlargement is not an issue. It's not discussed. It's also not seen negatively, but it's not an issue that the German public concerns itself with. And if we see media reporting on the region, it's on the situation in Serbia, it's now for the 30th anniversary of the Dayton Agreement, but it always has kind of a skeptical undertone to it. So I agree, I think we really urgently need to also start a debate within EU member states. And again, I think credibility of enlargement really goes both ways, and we do need a lot of honesty, I think, in the process. So much trust in the process has been lost, and for good reasons. I mean, North Macedonia is the best case in point as to why the EU has lost a lot of credibility. But I really, as I said, I do see a new momentum. The question is really if this can come together. Are we going to actually see sufficient domestic reforms, especially in the fundamentals, for EU member states to be able to change their view, to overcome their skepticism? But I think that we really need to see that. Maybe not everything needs to be perfect, but those who really want for enlargement to work, they will need arguments also in increasingly skeptic publics. In the German parliament, you need a simple majority. If you look at France, the majority needs to be much wider. So I really think that this is something that we need to look at. And if we look at the reforms in the region, and I will close with that, you mentioned that there has been still a lot of challenges in Montenegro when it comes to independent institutions. I would also invite everyone to look at the scoreboard of the implementation of the growth plan. It also shows you that the dynamic in terms of reforms is not as big as can be seen. There is not a single country that has even made use of 50% of the funds of the growth plan that they would have been entitled to with full reforms. And to end on an optimistic note, I really think that at this point, for the moment, anyone who is already in the process of accession negotiations can actually join the race. I really see no reason why North Macedonia cannot catch up, provided the constitutional change happens. If you look at acquis alignment, for example, North Macedonia is still, I think, second in the region, if not second and third, but it's way ahead of Albania, for example. And also that, I think, is really a factor when it comes to the situation in Albania. Acquis, the dynamic and the opening of all clusters is one thing, but I think this mainly happened because the EU decided not to have any opening benchmarks anymore. All other countries had to fulfill opening benchmarks for the opening of clusters. Now we can debate whether that is a good thing because Albania was able to open everything, or whether it's a bad thing because the EU has also lost leverage and conditionality over that. I'm not even decided which way I see it, but I think we need to be clear about that. But Albania has a much longer way also to go than Montenegro when it comes to actual acquis alignment, and that is a lot of work. And finally, and I promise I will actually finish with that, I'm worried when I hear just copy paste, it's gonna be okay, because that is exactly what the European Union decided not to do anymore. We wanted to look at a track record. We wanted to make sure that reforms are actually functional, and now geopolitics happened. So I don't know where we'll end in the end of the day, but I'm a bit worried that if we do not have it as an honest process from all sides, I'm a bit worried that it might backfire.
Thanks. I think this is the best panel so far. I've learned a lot myself. And what I'd like to do now is give our panelists a chance to respond to each other and have a bit of a discussion before I open it to you, the audience, for your questions and comments. And to start us off, I want to comment on something that Ana Maria mentioned. You reminded me of a meeting I had in, I believe it was 2008, with the European Commission official in charge of enlargement of North Macedonia, or at the time, former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, and she told me, you know, Macedonia is the front runner. They are ahead of everyone else, including Croatia. So Croatia joined 5 years after that time. North Macedonia is where it is. And things have happened in North Macedonia that, there was a major terrorist incident in 2015, there was total takeover of government, abuse of the intelligence agencies. Now we're talking about, well, possibly we'll not join the European Union at all for many years after Albania and Macedonia. My point is, if it had not been for that, then the blockade of Greece, we could now already have North Macedonia as a member for 10 years or 15 years, an EU of 28. So this is the consequences of that decision by Greece and now by Bulgaria are enormous. And this is really fundamentally a reciprocal relationship between the aspiring members and all of the current members that we need to think about when we think about enlargement. That's what your comments prompted with me. And now, should we go in reverse order, or how do we want to do this? Does anyone want to volunteer to go first? Okay, why don't we just do that?
I can make a quick reply to the fact that what I'm arguing here is the idea that EU really wants an essential change. So we know that Montenegro will join because of two reasons. We are a NATO member and we have access to the sea. So geopolitically speaking, those two reasons are sufficient for Montenegro to propel in this accession process. But the examples that I gave actually show that I'm not really sure that EU really is looking for an internal strategic systemic change. So I'm arguing that because when we show to the EU representatives the concrete examples of corruption, of simply anything connected to the rule of law, to the chapter 23 and 24, what we see is actually not acceptance from them that that is happening or that that is happening in that big amount. It's simply they're downgrading every hour comment. So I'm arguing the fact that EU wants really a change, or they want to fit us because we are a suitable small country, we will fit economically with sufficient reforms and so on in everything that needs to be done as a homework since towards 28 or 2030.
I'd like to reflect on the point of Albania's preparedness. In fact, Albania has put all its efforts to meeting the benchmark, which are mostly meeting the alignment with of the acquis. But still, and this was my point that I mentioned, that it's not guaranteed that it will meet the 2030 deadline, is because of lack of institutional resilience. So there is no guarantee that the country will not backslide in practice, as we have seen in many areas, particularly as we have seen with democratic backsliding. The quality of elections, like the May election, did not improve. To the contrary, it worsened, and as a result of it, it may lead to further repercussions. And but on the other hand, there is a problem of reaching to audiences in EU member countries, particularly. I mean, we have seen how the situation has changed in the Netherlands, how the public opinion in the Netherlands has become so supportive. But this is also good and the bad news, because public opinions are fluctuating to different developments, domestic and also international. So we cannot say for sure that even if Albania meets the interim benchmark, still the cluster one will be the last one to close, and the condition for not setting benchmark was also because of this guarantee on the new methodology allows that, so the EU can always keep this as a safeguard so that the country doesn't. And the challenge is for Albania is actually to meet all these fundamental criteria. And also it has some issues on cluster 5, which was the last to open a few days ago, because it has the least level of preparedness there. So technically, it may have issues with that particular cluster. But I think that the main challenges for Albania will be meeting the benchmark for cluster 1, and these are very important for also shaping positively or negatively the public opinions in member states, which will then will be the final to adjudicate about the process.
It was an interesting mental exercise to imagine North Macedonia as part of the EU for 10 or 15 years, because in my not so long career I've only been in the field for times when the process has been blocked. So it would definitely be a whole different story right now with North Macedonia, and probably a good example for all the Western Balkans, maybe even other countries would have been in. We've been called front runners before, and that's something that the other countries that are not front runners should not take for granted, because the title can be taken back from the EU. So we've been there, done that, and it didn't turn out great. So what I'm afraid is that having accession and enlargement without internal reforms for North Macedonia, I'm not sure how that will turn out, because if we are talking about even starting opening clusters and chapters, the process can be vetoed again from another country on every interim benchmark and so on. So again, that would create more distrust in the process when we have started once again and then being blocked for more and more times. So in my opinion, introducing at least QMV for those interim benchmarks would not hurt anyone, because you will have a country that probably has been reformed, and then when you come to the final decision, it will again be unanimity. So it will be prosperous for the candidate countries as well. Yeah, that's something.
I think it's important to start with a question: if we're talking about the EU, who's the EU? Because the overly positive messaging in Montenegro is coming from the Commission. It's not coming from member states, but the member states at the end of the day will be the ones making the decisions. So that's exactly what I'm warning of, that I think that we have this gap of the Commission's messaging, which is very, very positive. And I've heard many times what you were describing, that they actually, that they're deliberately turning a blind eye. And then you have the Council on the other hand, which has a track record of not being too prone to closing both eyes. So that's exactly what I'm warning of, and that's exactly what I'm worried about. I would really caution, because of the positive messaging, to think that it is an automatism and that Montenegro will join anyways. The argument of Montenegro being a small country, yes, it's digestible economically when it comes to structural funds, etc. This is a completely different story, as if we were talking about Ukraine as the sort of other extreme. But as long as the Council requires so much unanimity, even one more country makes a huge difference. I'm not saying that I don't believe that Montenegro can make it. I'm just a bit cautious about the overly positive messaging that we see on the one hand and the reality on the ground, and then the question what the Council will make of that. And I'm just saying, I think we need to be closer together in a way. I think the Commission needs to also very clearly outline that there is still a lot of work ahead of Montenegro and the other countries as well. I'm just talking about Montenegro as it's the furthest advanced. But I think if anyone can do it, it's Montenegro at this point, at the moment. Which brings me to Albania. I agree the biggest challenge will be the fundamentals. This will be the case in Montenegro. I think that goes for all candidate countries. There was a deliberate political decision in the European Union to not have opening benchmarks for the opening of clusters for Albania, in order to use the momentum and open as much as possible so that we can start the work on the actual chapters. And this has much less to do with preparedness than we had in other countries in the region. Again, I'm not saying that it's necessarily wrong, I'm just saying that I think it's important to be aware of that. We've even opened chapters in which Albania was backsliding exactly at the time that we opened it. I don't think that we have done that in other countries. Again, I just think it's important to be mindful of it. And maybe one last remark that I forgot in my first intervention. I would be a bit cautious about using the MFF as a pointer whether or not the EU is going to be ready to accept new member states. If I remember correctly, please correct me if I'm wrong, I think Marta Kos even said we will adapt the budget if a country is ready. And since we're talking about most likely Montenegro being ready, maybe even Albania, although I'm a bit more cautious when it comes to that, we're talking about small countries within an EU budget. So I think this is really something that can be easily adjustable. And I'm just saying I wouldn't read too much into it if it does not foresee. It would be different if we were talking about the accession of, for example, Ukraine. I have trouble imagining that this would not have to be reflected in the budget and in many other kind of policies as well. But I think when it comes to the small countries that we're talking about, I wouldn't take the budget as a pointer.
Thanks. I think we have about 20 minutes now. We can go till 5:20? Okay. So there was an eager question right there. So we'll start with you, and let's take maybe a couple before we respond. So if we can have the microphone over here.
Just a brief note and maybe a reflection from colleagues, but perhaps Valeska. You challenge us to think 2030 in a way, and while it might be difficult to think in positive terms because it's unpredictable, we know what 2030 might look like if EU reneges on the commitment to keep this decade open for the Western Balkans. So we start to see these now mixed messages from the EU that somehow the countries of the region need to do more and more, like moving the target. I think this will have serious ramifications. The assumption that somehow we need to be perfect to be members of the European Union, to me it's a bit too ambitious. No country was ready in 2004, to be honest, that joined the EU. It was always a geopolitical decision. Romania and Bulgaria were not ready in 2007 to be members of the EU, but the lesson is that today EU is better and Europe is better, that you have these countries inside. I mean, Slovenia is still benefactor of the social cohesion fund. So, and plus, once you're a member, as it was mentioned, there is no guarantee that you're now democratically resilient. You can backslide in it as well. But I think what we have seen with the message that this decade may be a decade when we have one or two Western Balkan 6 countries become members of the European Union has been a fundamental driver in some of the countries at least of hope, or some sense of hope. I mean, the EU learned important lessons from our wars in the 90s, which inspired some level of integration and speaking with one voice. We, forgot those lessons. It took now Ukraine to go to war for the EU to go back to the lessons it learned in the Balkans. And I mean, Ukraine is fighting for the very idea of Europe. So to treat these files simply as technocratic files, both with the Western Balkans and Ukraine, I think it's missing that bigger picture that we discussed earlier. So just caution that hopefully there won't be these kind of messages of moving target. I mean, to end, Kosovo is a clear example. Had the EU delivered on visa liberalization in 2016, we would have talked about a different Kosovo today. But some member states started to question even Commission's assessment. When you had a bizarre situation where European Commission said the country has fulfilled conditions, and then some EU member states saying, no, we don't think Commission's assessment actually is right. We have other assessments. And this just sends the wrong kind of messages.
Thank you very much. My name is Bart de Bruin. I'm based at the Dutch Embassy in Belgrade. Although I'm posted in Belgrade, I follow the rule of law developments in the region as a whole. I'm glad that all of you, I think, point at the discrepancy we see between, on the one side, institutional developments, legislative institutions being developed, and implementations. A huge discrepancy we see there. And what was even mentioned, that there's a risk of backsliding the moment the countries join the EU. And that's exactly the risk that my country is pointing at all the time. Yes, geopolitical interest, but on the other hand, the moment weak countries in the field of rule of law will join the EU, it also makes the EU weaker also on the geopolitical stage. So that's exactly the reason why we keep pushing for the rule of law. And that's also what you do, so I'm glad to hear also the concerns that are similar to ours. But what is the message you convey? I would like to hear a bit more. What is your message you convey to politicians in Brussels, to the Commission, to other EU member states, when pointing at that rule of law concerns? What is their response? What message do you get back? Because if we look to the like-minded in the field of pushing for rule of law within the European Council, it's not so many countries, member states nowadays, that have the similar view as we do. We stand quite lonely in that regard, so I would like to hear a bit more of that. Thank you.
Thank you, and if you could pass over to Frauke, and while you're doing that, I want to just say, using my moderator's privilege, I wanted to ask a very similar question. What are your countries telling the legislators of the member states and the public of the member states that will have to approve membership about your countries that would make them think that you are, good candidates? That I think is something that I'd like to know. Please.
Thank you, Marco. I want to touch a bit on something that was mentioned by several of you, and also during our panel, I think Agon mentioned it, and that is this debate on safeguards, and I think this also connects to the question of the Dutch colleague. So we have this idea now, and this is also pushed by the Commission, to have some kind of transition periods when it comes to certain membership rights, such as bilateral vetoes, once the countries enter. And my question would be chiefly to Valeska maybe, but to everyone that feels addressed, let's say, don't you also see that there is a risk? I mean, the idea is, of course, to have a track record on the rule of law before having the full membership rights and prevent exactly what you said, to have another potential bilateral veto. But isn't there also a risk that because they will already be in, that let's say I am a political leader who is doing corrupted, like is corrupted, wouldn't it be also for me an incentive to say, okay, I don't have a bilateral veto on the Brussels level, but I brought my country into the EU and now I can continue doing my corrupted things, I just don't have a veto, I don't care. Isn't there also this kind of risk, maybe a bit provocative? And maybe on Nevenka, when it comes to the accession treaty of the EU, so Kost recently said that this would, the working group in the council to draft the accession treaty would maybe already be formed at the end of this year, and that it would be a kind of blueprint also for future accessions. So also Albanian colleague can also comment on this. Do you see room there for kind of a cooperation for those countries that are closest now, maybe including Ukraine and Moldova, to kind of advocate jointly to have fair conditions and equal conditions, because we see that Montenegro alone would of course be in a rather weak position, and then the other countries would be maybe in a worse situation. Maybe very briefly, if I may, to Anna Maria, I recently talked to a German MP, I think I mentioned this to you during the coffee break, and he was saying we really must not lose sight of North Macedonia because they might just be the next Serbia. And we have, of course, seen a precedent of that in the country. So how real do you think that risk is, and what kind of safeguards do you think we can put now?
Thanks. So should we maybe go in reverse order?
Sure. I would like to start with a comment from the Netherlands, actually, because, yeah, I think coming from Germany myself, I think, yeah, our countries are, I don't speak for the German government, but I think our countries are among those that really value the rule of law. That's why I keep saying I think we need more honesty in the process, including honest assessments. When it comes to the notion of moving targets, especially if we compare to the 2004-2007 accessions, I think that we really must not forget that the EU has fundamentally changed over the past 20 years. Not just because it has enlarged, it has become bigger, but also the acquis keeps evolving daily. And also, if you look at European law specifically, the role and the understanding of the importance of rule of law within the European Union has also fundamentally evolved in the past 20 years. This is not to say that we have seen moving targets that were entirely unjustified. Again, North Macedonia being a case in point, but you will find also other examples for that. But I would really warn against this idea of, 2004, the conditions were completely different than today. We're talking about joining a completely different European Union. I'm aware that this kind of hurts the notion of credibility of the process, but I really think that we should not forget that. I tend to disagree a little bit with, the notion of pushing technocratic files. It used to be the case exactly like that, and I think this is something that has deeply hurt the accession process. For at least a decade, if not longer, the EU accession process was an extremely technocratic process. My argument would be, and I'm simplifying slightly to make a point and be a bit provocative as well, but my argument would be that we have moved from a way too technocratic process, which lacked a political steer, to a process that seems to be only driven by politics. And I think that is also wrong as well, because of the nature of the European Union, because of the fundamental rule of the fundamentals. They're called like that for a reason. So I think it's a bit of both. This whole questioning of the EU Commission's assessment, I think, is something that is extremely problematic, and it speaks to sometimes a lack of trust, I would say, between member states and the Commission. But we have also heard examples from Montenegro that this skepticism, let's call it that, may be justified. And I think that was even more the case with the previous enlargement commissioner, who obviously had a very politicized positioning in this. So I think you will never rectify that member states might make their own assessments and might draw their own conclusions from that. I think it's just something that we will have to accept. But again, I think this makes it all the more important that we close the gap of the of the overly positive messaging and restore really honesty in the process. Yes, there was progress. Yes, the door is open, but it's not as rosy as might be seen from some of the statements. At least that could really be my key point would be honesty. On the safeguards, transition period, etc. I think it really depends how this looks like, and we have heard so many completely different ways of how this could look like. Personally, I think if we look at something like Politico was reporting on, that new member states will not have veto rights until the European Union is reformed, I would be adamantly against that, and I don't think that any accession country should accept that, because that means that it's not in your own hands whether or not you're ever going to have voting rights in the European Union. I don't think that anyone can want that. If we're talking about some kind of a probation period, I don't know, we accept Montenegro as a member state, but we are fully aware that there are some shortcomings in some areas, and we have clear conditions as to what they need to achieve in the fundamentals in order to, I don't know, gain the voting rights, I would probably think a bit differently about that. But for me, it really comes down to the details. It needs to be in the hands of the countries joining, though, whether or not they achieve the full privilege of member states. And on the risk of continued corruption, that's exactly why I think the fund
with regular citizens, which we do, my organization regularly does. The most heard argument is like Bulgaria and Romania were ready. They weren't, so we will join in the same manner, and then we will gradually become EU member states worthy of membership. So the general view is exactly like that, and I do believe that there is some truth in it. So give us time to, first of all, use the EU funds, and then we will develop, infrastructurally speaking, but in any other way, give us a chance to send our students to study in the EU and so on, so they can come back and rebuild the aspects of the countries that are not yet ready to be on a EU level. And I believe that's the idea behind, okay, turning a blind eye for some things. We will let them go, build up eventually. How did we, to answer the answer from the Dutch representative, how did we actually convince them that we're a good candidate for government that did nothing? Literally, there is a proof that Ministry of Internal Affairs was incapable to send a periodical report to the EU Commission. So from that point, a year later, we became a front runner. How and why is because we formed what we absolutely believe that that party was formed together with the European Union. We formed a political party called Movement Europe Now. And everything around that party actually revolved around European Union and the accession. So that was the beginning of the story, and we've been in that story for 4 years now, 5 years now. So it isn't a natural change that occurred in our society. It is very much a political decision. As much as ours, it is a political decision very much of the EU. And when it comes to the potential cooperation, there is a myth that kind of lived for a long period of time in Western Balkan region, and that is that we will go on together. We will all be accepted in one big package. Of course, now that is out of the window, but I do agree on the fact that EU is now testing. We're using us as a pilot program to see how the rest of the Western Balkan will act, and we're okay with that. We can be a guinea pig in the entire process. We can be a case study, definitely. But what we do not want to be, and I will finish with that, we do not want to be a second-class member from now on. So if we are part of the EU, please make us a normal part, a normal member as other countries are.
Just a word of caution on the Romania-Bulgaria comparison. I worked a lot with accession negotiations for Albania and North Macedonia back in 2019. The most often argument against the opening was the example of Romania and Bulgaria. We accepted them too early and see we have problems now. So you can flip that argument in both ways. I'm not saying it's my view, but
when it comes to the question of the track record, in the case of Albania, we are seeing some progress that is being made about corruption and organized crime. There have been serious investigations going on, and the country has undertaken some sort of very serious reforms to reach to this point, which have been also very costly. But on the other hand, and this performance of the judiciary has been somehow hailed and portrayed as a positive progress for Albania. But we see a lot of issues with the executive branch, and the fact that there is no responsibility by the government generally to assume responsibility for these corruptive actions which come from within the government. So everything is limited to the fact that well, the justice is doing its business, so this is why they are there, this is why we have undertaken the reform. So without assuming the responsibility, and what we are seeing is that over the years, over the last few years since the reform was implemented, the cases that have been investigated have not contributed to reducing corruption. So more recent cases of corruption has been more substantial in terms of amount, the volume of fraud, meaning that from the prevention side. So this is like not a good signal if you want to look very carefully at the track record, because it's mixed. So on the one hand, there is a judiciary that is doing or is performing well, but there is no taking of responsibility by those who are a subject of this judiciary proceeding. So I think this sends a wrong signal actually when it comes to the guarantees. But on the other hand, we see that, for instance, the Albanian Prime Minister has voiced that even contrary to what you are saying, that we are even ready to join formally the EU even by reducing some of the rights that the member states, for instance, to relinquish the right to use the veto for decision making and so on. So this is something that goes in line with the gradual kind of accession and opening to a certain program. So it shows the eagerness of the government to move on. On the other hand, it does not send actually setbacks. So it remains to be seen in this years whether there will be a change actually on this of this kind of performance. To the fact that packaging this with other countries like Moldova, parts, for instance, Albania has done a lot of good work actually in terms of alignment on cluster 2 internal market, and there has been some buy-in by Moldova and Ukraine about using Albania's experience in this respect. But these are just only partial exchanges, so I don't think that.
So on the question of what's the country doing regarding it, I think that when it comes to rule of law reforms requested from the EU, a lot comes to the credibility that the process has nowadays in North Macedonia. We've seen the last progress report, the country report, and the way it has been communicated from the government in power has been very negative. I mean, it was even claimed that the report was biased, that they're trying to punish us for not doing the constitutional amendments. So in that sense, requesting rule of law reforms, even though when we know that we need them and that they're the core of the EU accession process. Sometimes, in times like this, and in the case of North Macedonia, it's very difficult to explain to the citizens why we're doing that when we're stuck in the process for so long. And I'm gonna connect that to the question of Frauke and what should we do and what kind of safeguards we should put in place there. I think that first we need a success story from the region, although we've been coupled with Albania and it's a bit, and we're more aligned with the EU acquis. We need to see a success story in the region, that the process actually will be fruitful for at least one country or two in the best case scenario. Then the gradual integration, I think it's very important for the citizens to feel certain benefits of being part of the EU, so we can build the trust back in the Union and what it means to be a European citizen. But I would agree with the colleagues here that it can never be an alternative to the full membership. To get tangible results sooner and not waiting for the process to end. And finally, I think that there must be a political will from governments to do more, whether it's on the institutional or a political level, but also there has to be a political will from the EU and a better communication what membership for the citizen will be, because I don't see, and I think the citizens do not see an alternative to the membership, to the EU membership.
And on that note, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all very much for your attention, and let's thank our excellent panelists for this contribution.
They also need to bring the podium. Will they bring the pulpit? Yeah. Just take everyone my remote.
We can. That was an excellent panel discussion indeed. Thank you all very much for your attention and your patience. We will just make the space now for the 3 final concluding remarks. Alexander.
So thank you all once again, and join us in welcoming our Executive Director once again.
Executive Directors.
We are approaching to the end of Kosovo Peace and Democracy Summit. We thank you all for taking all your efforts to follow the entire event. I think that we were able to listen to very qualitative presentations throughout the days, and also to hear interesting views and to hear interesting messages. As we have underlined throughout the event, that some of the main challenges that we see in the region, but not only, are those that challenge the democratic values of our societies. And therefore, as we received a lot of different messages today that aims to strengthen our efforts to protect the democratic values, I also joined this message that, yeah, indeed, to maintain the democratic values, we need also to be part of this way of life which promotes democratic values constantly, and which enables us to sit together and have this inspiration from one another in order to inspire each other and to be more active, especially having in mind the challenge that it's a momentum that we need to be even more active when it comes to spreading our message. So I hope that you have been able to get these kind of messages, and that you, after this event you will continue doing your excellent work that you are doing by contributing on the peace and also in spreading development. Thank you very much for attending the event. For those that are going to be part of the tomorrow's events, we will continue the discussion also tomorrow, but for those that you are going to stay only for today, thank you very much for being part of this event, and also thank you to my colleagues here who together we have been able to do this event. Even though like in the beginning of the year there have been some difficulties thinking ahead, even for the Peace and Democracy Summit, taking into consideration that the future of civil society in the region has been challenged by a lot of development, especially those related to supporting us, but we will continue. I think that those that have done a great job, they will continue to do a great job despite the difficulties that we are going to challenge. So let's hope that similar in the near future, KCSS will continue its efforts to bring together the civil society from a region, and also we will continue to cooperate with our colleagues, including our partners NSI and Bunker, on the similar activities, but also we hope that KPS 5 will happen, hopefully, as we always do, in the September next year.
Yeah. Thank you all for coming and being part of. I want to share some insights, and I want to take them, from a perspective of for me, as having experienced this growth of the joint initiative for 4 years. I'm always amazed, how this group here, but also in the previous years, I think it's a concentration of very smart people. It's fair to say that. Not just smart people, but I think really, really seasoned experts. And you can see that, you can feel it from year to year. Less optimism, determination as to what are the steps ahead. And the other thing that I want to say is that by being this concentration of experts, I think there is a huge challenge. And I think it's a bigger one than before. The challenges were in a way expressed by panelists. One of them is that there is a growing problem with media literacy. For me, even for me, it's very hard sometimes to understand, to grasp the complexity of your work. Imagine for other people and the general population. On the other hand, I think there is a growing hate towards experts and civil society activists by state actors, and obviously there's always been opposition, but now I think this hate has into concrete actions against these people who dare to criticize and dare to sort of demystify their statements. And governments in Serbia and Kosovo are extremely, I would say, hostile towards critical. They have shown that also with concrete actions of trying to attempt at assassinating our character, and this happens usually with a very well-known name calling. in Kosovo, the Albanian population, Albanian NSI is probably working with the enemy, and I'm pretty sure us here in Serbia are considered the same. So I think this has not changed. I think this has intensified. So I guess the final, question that I have is that if this rift, so this bubble keeps growing and growing, I think the problem would then be that it's probably only among ourselves that we will be talking, and I think this is a challenge that we have to think about. Maybe how to do more outreach and how to try and persuade government officials to come to these events. Although I'm sure they've been watching the live stream and trying to pick who is more dangerous than. Yeah, I think this is a great challenge. So, and I'd love to hear what you guys think about it. If you still have more energy, thanks.
Well, we have come to an end of this fourth edition of KPDS, and I have to tell you, every time we are in the process of organizing it and planning it, I'm always saying to myself, never again, but then it happens, and I'm just very, very proud of the team effort and the work put behind. But also, I'm very thankful to all of you for sticking with us here, actually for first coming and being a part of this event, but also staying throughout and engaging in these discussions. So thank you very much for that. But more than everything else, to all of our partners and the donors that made this possible, I really want to make thanks to our teams. And I would like to invite them to come to the stage, just so you can actually see the people behind the scenes that made this possible. So please, join us. And I would say that this would be, yeah.
But I will invite also colleagues from Apple and CMI to join us, because you have been very helpful towards this event. And I don't know if colleagues from RDF are still here or...